and we'll make it available online afterwards so we can share it with folks who couldn't be here. So welcome. My name is Amy Montgomery. I'm from the Penn Institute for Urban Research. And on behalf of Penn IUR, the McHarg Center, and the Weitzman School, we're thrilled to welcome back one of our alumnus, Dan Campo, to share his latest book, Post-Industrial DIY, Recovering American Built Icons. Dan is Associate Professor and Chair of the Department of Graduate Built Environment Studies in the School of Architecture and Planning at Morgan State University. He also serves as the Director of Morgan's Graduate Program in City and Regional Planning. Over his career, he has received several awards and distinctions, including a National Endowment for the Humanities Research Fellowship and Morgan State University's Most Outstanding Scholar in 2015. We've gathered tonight to hear Dan discuss his book, Post-Industrial DIY, Recovering American Built Icons, which comes out this month from Fordham University Press, and we are delighted to have copies outside for sale. The book chronicles grassroots efforts to recover, rebuild, and enjoy architecturally iconic but economically obsolete places in the American Rust Belt. Dan's research on post-industrial cities started here in Philadelphia when he was getting his PhD in city and regional planning. His first book, The Accidental Playground, Brooklyn Waterfront Narratives of the Undesigned and Unplanned, was published in 2013. And in this new book, Dan explores the post-industrial landscapes of Detroit, Pittsburgh, Buffalo, and others. After Dan speaks, Fritz Steiner, our dean, Dean and Paley Professor of the Stuart Weitzman School of Design, and Catherine Seavitt, Professor and Chair of the Department of Landscape Architecture, will offer their reflections and then join Dan in conversation, and we'll take questions from you all. So please join me in welcoming Dan Campo.
Thanks, Amy. I'm really excited to be back here. Thanks to Fritz and Catherine, and thanks to Jeannie Birch, who's was supposed to be here, but she couldn't make it, and I know she'll enjoy watching the video. I was in Jeannie's class earlier today. I am, as Amy noted, this research started right here when I was at Penn. Right. Yeah. Let's see. Right. It started at Penn with what became my dissertation and eventually the accidental playground. And what I was exploring then was the informal use of post-industrial space, abandoned post-industrial space in the Brooklyn waterfront. What I noticed in these spaces is that they were far from abandoned. They'd been appropriated by various people doing various things, a very wide variety of things. And people asked me what it was all about. And I said, it's the site that people go to make their own environment. This was a kind of compelling landscape that attracted others. There were several spaces up and down the Brooklyn waterfront that were like this. This was one of the one with the most concentrated activity. Farther to the south was the Domino sugar refinery, which actually was industrial, not post-industrial, until 2004, when amid several rezonings, it was shut down. The Domino plant came to the fore in 2014 with Kara Walker's Subtlety or the Marvelous Sugar Baby, which took place in the raw sugar warehouse. People came into that site and said, wow, right? What an incredible installation, and saw this interplay between the work of art and its setting. Of course, this waterfront is changing and being transformed through investment, through government incentives, a big rezoning, several rezonings, and the raw sugar warehouse was gone, as were all the other buildings. Just the core building, which is now being used as just as a stabilized ruin. There's a new building that's risen in its place. This is from, I think this photograph is from 2020. There are more buildings. Beijing on the East River. The same dynamic that was going on in Brooklyn was also going on in Philadelphia. It was a little different. It was a little more diffused, but there were plenty of post-industrial spaces. And actually, my advisors here in Philadelphia at the time challenged me, like, you're looking at this stuff in Brooklyn, what's happening here in Philadelphia? So I found a lot of spaces. Some of them were abandoned, and some of them had this kind of appropriated dynamic, like the Reading Railroad or Pier, which surprisingly is still kind of anarchic and raw. And I also got interested in a lot of interior spaces. And what I noticed was that these spaces were, in some cases, disappearing. Some were being co-opted by the market, not unlike Brooklyn, and others were being demolished to support economic development. So here is the cramped shipyard machine shop, which was brought down in 2007 to create a new exit off of I-95 to feed the Sugar House casino, which was built on the grounds of the former Revere Sugar refiner. Of course, one of the most, in my mind, tragic of all of the demolitions in the first decade of the 21st century was the Gilbert Building, which was a 10-story neoclassical office building of reinforced concrete that was listed on the National Register in 1986. The building was vacant, it was deteriorating, and the owners of the building started renting it out to arts groups. By the late 90s, there was a kind of concentration of arts groups. The collective Vox Populi had located in this building, the Highwire Gallery, the Asian Arts Initiative, and the Fabric Workshop and Museum all rented space and did kind of minimal sweat equity restorations of their space. The word got out about this building, and people from really all over the Northeast began descending upon it every first Friday. And it was catalyzing the activity around it. But the state of Pennsylvania valued that particular site and about 17 others for the extension of the Pennsylvania Convention Center, which you can see here in the background. So it's going to be built out to meet Broad Street. So cannibalized by the Pennsylvania Convention Center, that building is now gone. And I was thinking about the accidental playground and some of the arts and culture and sweat equity renovations of industrial buildings. I was thinking, what if we could combine these two models? What if there was big sites with buildings on them, not just vacant lots, and with iconic architecture where post-industrial experiments could grow and become something else incrementally? Where would I find that? So this is why I wound up in Detroit. Of course, Detroit has a lot of post-industrial monuments, and many of them were and are quite spectacular, including the Michigan Central Station, the great neoclassical train station built by the New York Central Railroad at the same time they finished Grand Central Station in 1913, which had been vacant since 1988 and well looted and stripped. The building actually became more famous as a ruin than it had been as a train station. And if you'd seen that Eminem video from 2009, and I'm forgetting the song, but it's been viewed on YouTube 500 or 600 million times, is filmed inside of that building. Part of that video is also filmed inside the Packard plant. Packard plant was the largest automobile plant in the world when it was completed in the first decade of the 20th century, the first built primarily of reinforced concrete, and it would become a model for every automobile plant in the United States built between until around 1940. Also a model for just about every factory there is that was built, whatever the purpose, during those years. If you look around at old factories, they all kind of look a lot like the Packard plant. Packard left the plant in 1956. There was an industrial park and various tenants there. Eventually, by the early 21st century, all those tenants were gone, and the building on over 40 acres of property, several dozen buildings, became a kind of ruinous jungle that people explored. Some good things happened there and some not so good, chronicled in the book. I was really interested in, I don't own a car, but I got really interested in the places where cars were made. And I went to all of the I had a book of automobile architecture, automobile factory architecture, and I went to all those sites as I could in metropolitan Detroit. And what I found was a lot of the most famous plants, including 4 different Albert Kahn designed plants, were subsumed by the Jefferson North assembly plant. You can see this kind of logistics landscape. It's not really urban, land berm, fences, like what's going on behind there, like a Manhattan project, right? And then Buick City and Flint, complete erasure. Now, perhaps some people say it's the biggest brownfield in the United States, perhaps the world. Eventually, I found my way to Buffalo. I kind of worked my way back to the East Coast. And what I found in Buffalo was the sign was promising signs, something could happen in these iconic buildings, other than demolition and other than restoration to the tune of, $500 million, right? At the Central Terminal in Buffalo, citizens got together, collective action, traditional grassroots preservation action, and fought absentee owners and owners that weren't doing what they should do with this building. Eventually, the city got involved and they took the building back and gave it to a not-for-profit corporation that was formed in 1998 to manage this building and oversee its restoration. There wasn't an immediate there wasn't an economic rationale for engaging this building in a kind of conventional way. And so for about 30 years, the building was used for festivals and arts and different events. And that was, to me, I was seeing something. I don't know where this experiment was going, but Central Terminal was a piece of it. Also, I explored the landscape of grain elevators. In Buffalo, the great Rayner Banham said, it's the concrete Atlantis, the greatest concentration of concrete grain elevators anywhere in the world. And many of them had become these kind of ruinous post-industrial wildscapes. I also looked at conventional successes in historic preservation across the Rust Belt. Places like the Louis Sullivan's Guarantee Building on the left, and H.H. Richardson's Buffalo State Hospital on the right, where for-profit ownership, not for-profit ownership, but in both cases, quite a bit of public money had to go in to save these buildings. It was not an assured thing. Now they're kind of celebrated as Buffalo jewels, but 30 years ago, their futures were far from certain. And the Richardson Olmsted complex was, people were calling for its demolition. You can't go to Buffalo without going to the Darwin Martin House, Frank Lloyd Wright's Darwin Martin House. And here you have a incredible restoration of a classic, Frank Lloyd Wright home. But to restore that, it costs $50 million, which included, and this is now 25 years ago, which includes the $10 million pavilion, the Toshiko Mori pavilion that I'm standing in to get this photo. Of course, if you're interested in industrial heritage, you've got to look at international examples. And I looked at a few and I visited a few. Of course, the one that haunts every American industrial heritage project is Duisburg, right? Duisburg Nord, the part of the 80s, I think 86 sites as part of Emscher Park across the Ruhr Valley in Germany. This was the former Thyssen steel plant. So, unbelievable, until you're there, it's really unbelievable that the landscape. Also, a kind of permissiveness about what you can do, and the old buildings are there for you to climb on and have picnics in and so on. This is a kind of gold standard for industrial preservation, but one that we haven't been able to realize in the United States for a lot of reasons, because of public funding is not there, the public commitment to architecture is not there. We have a different view about architecture, about historic architecture, more like Frank Lloyd Wright, restoring these buildings as objects rather than these more complicated places or landscapes. So that's kind of where that sort of frames the study, right? Like, how can we break this dichotomy of either restoring landmarks to this pristine condition for upper end uses, or completely demolishing them and clearing them and putting a warehouse on them, or parking, or whatever you like. So this is the Great Northern Grain Elevator, the largest grain elevator in the world when it was completed in 1897, celebrated by Mendelssohn, Gropius, Le Corbusier. And this building was cleared in last 22-23. Domino, I've already showed you. What if we had a strategy that was somewhere in between complete clearance and complete restoration? What would that be? And what would happen in the future to those places if the process was incremental? So I came up with these questions, trained here at Penn, so I always have to have a research question. And I built a study around it. And, what I'm interested in here is, just as I just stated, how do we preserve and engage? Because we don't want to fossilize these places. Sites that are iconic, meaningful, that have potential, that are places of possibility, but are not valued by the market. And then how can we do this in a way where they keep their post-industrial authenticity, the things that drew all those people to the Brooklyn waterfront or to Domino, right? We don't want to just make it a whole bunch of high-end hotels, not that that's so terrible, but how can this be more democratic? And then how can we leverage this to generate a kind of more responsive form of urbanism around these sites? And this is where I came up with this idea of the post-industrial DIY. I'll just catch up here, right? I call it a movement. Maybe it's not quite a movement. I'm calling it a movement. Maybe it'll become a movement that aims to recover, preserve, and interpret, reuse, and celebrate significant industrial and industrial era places through locally directed and sweat equity driven building and landscape practices, cultural programming, and a range of smaller itinerant activities. So I'm including here the stuff that happens at Packard, the breaking in and the art and the events, and the kind of grassroots activity and DIY restoration that was happening at the central terminal. This is not a defined set of practices, but an approach, one that emphasizes on the ground actions and making the most of limited resources. as I said, okay, so we're not getting the animation, that's fine. I was looking at about a dozen sites overall. Eventually I narrowed it down to 5, and I went to these sites I tried to go at least once a year, and I did a bunch of interviews, a lot of site visits, interviews, review of plans and so on. I kind of absorbed these sites, lived these sites, enmesh myself in these sites, embed myself as much as possible, even though I wasn't in these cities, wasn't living in these cities, and learn from them. I'll look at we'll just look at 2 of these 5 sites really quick. Silo City in Buffalo. These 4 grain elevators, 1, 2, 3, 4, part of Banham's Concrete Atlantis. By the 21st century, none of them were being used. This one will eventually be reused for a few years. There it is, Elevator Alley. This is where Rayner Banham stood in this site in the 1970s and looked towards that bridge and said, this is the finest urban prospect in all of Buffalo. And just like the accidental playground in Brooklyn, you didn't have to have a plan to get people down to use this incredible riverfront, and people went about their recreative activities, engaging with nature amid these very globally consequential structures. And there's the man that bought them, Rick Smith. He owned a metal fabrication facility. He's a 3rd-generation owner that was just to the south of these elevators. And all 4 of those elevators were built and developed by separate companies at the beginning of the 20th century. Eventually ConAgra, the agricultural giant, comes to own them all. And he was interested in getting these railroad tracks that would make it easier to bring stuff in and out of his site. And he spoke to ConAgra, and they said, yeah, we'll give you the railroad tracks, but I'll tell you what, we'll just give you everything. We'll give it to you for $160,000. So he said, okay, let me do this. Didn't know what he was going to do with them, but understood that they were important sites, and they meant a lot, not just to him, but to the world at large. He invited University at Buffalo architecture faculty to come in to begin preparing nominations for the National Historic Register. There was an architecture studio space, kind of temporary, set up in one of the ancillary buildings. And all the while he's developing this proposal to use these grain elevators to hold grain again, and he was going to build a ethanol refining facility amid them. So they would feed grain into this facility, and they would make ethanol, gajillion gallons of ethanol, and we would have preservation and reuse with the way these buildings were designed had to be used. It was a noble idea, but 2 things worked against him. One, the market for ethanol tanked going into the Great Recession. And 2, nobody wanted an ethanol plant. Like the people in the old First Ward who lived nearby was like, we don't want flammable liquid in our neighborhood. That's not a good idea. Eventually, there was a lot of permits. It was complicated. He got all the permits, but by then the market had tanked, and he pivoted. He said, oh, ethanol wasn't really fun anyway. I want to have fun. I want to open this up to the world. I want to share this. There are some things you just have to see, and that was what he said about it. This guy over on the right, Jim Watkins, was the caretaker, and he lived on this site for about 12 years or so. And he was also the de facto creative director of what would become Silo City. there's something really special and appealing about these places, or at least during the 2010s, right? This was not the Frank Lloyd Wright house. This was not stay with your group. This was not don't touch. This was a very visceral place, and a place full of surprises, right? Anywhere you go, you climb the floor, you would see something new, notice something new, spectacular views. Back towards the other grain elevators, there's the concrete central, still vacant, 50, almost 60 years later, this building is still vacant. So there was something, for anyone who's interested in post-industrial ruins, there was something that drew people there. So Rick Smith didn't have a kind of solid reuse plan. He kind of cowboyed it, right? He said, you know, we're going to open it up. We're going to invite people to come and propose things, and you know, we'll try and help them make it happen. We're also going to do a bunch of very small projects, sweat equity projects done with partnerships to build, you know, little docks, to have events, successional gardens, composting, that kind of a thing. So you've got your festivals, you have your landscape activity. We'll open up the grain elevators for poetry readings. Swanee Jim Watkins told me around 2014 or 15, he said, you know, Dan, this is the third largest, most important place for spoken word in the United States, right? So all of these, it was meant as a kind of local incubator of talent, but also a place where national poets would come and read their work, right? So people like Ocean Vuong and Jericho, Dennis Smith, Jericho Brown, and others read their work inside the silos of the Marine A grain elevator. Valerie Lyman's Breaking Ground, a visual and sound installation, images and sound taken from the Bakken region of North Carolina, thinking about booms and industrial booms and busts, The Inevitable. Torn Space Theater Company every year puts on a site-specific work inside or outside one of the grain elevators or part of the campus. It's 2015, they kill things. Pressing the wrong button here. 2022, ages underneath the cottonwood tree in an area in 1990 that would have been all railroad tracks and hardscape. There was no green, or very only little bits of green that were coming through the cracks. This cottonwood tree is a kind of miracle, it feels like. And a lot of water-based recreation, getting into a kayak. There was a triathlon there where there was kayaking from the dock behind the grain elevators. Then there was a bike ride, and then there was a scramble through in and out of the elevators. A couple hundred people participated. All while we're having all this arts and culture programming and gardening and community-based activity, Smith is aware that the roofs of the elevators are collapsing and that something more needs to be done. And he always had an idea that Silo City would become something else and be preserved in a way that it would be preserved for the ages, right? That this was a part of American building heritage, and the person who owned it had a responsibility to make sure those buildings are standing for future generations. So he had various development ideas that would help support the overall preservation of the campus and the 4 elevators. But he was trying to do this with partners, and the plans kept moving from building to building. Partners backed out. Eventually, he realized there was no way he could really do anything inside the elevators themselves, and he probably shouldn't. He should just leave them be and hopefully just stabilize them. So he developed this building, this office building, where the grain elevator workers waited out the blizzard of 1977. They were stuck there for a week, and they ate pancakes and drank coffee and played cards for a week because they couldn't get the plows into this peninsula where the grain elevators were. He developed this, and then the Duende, that building, and then the Watu Cantina was a kind of secondary project. And he created this space. There's a bar, restaurant, art space. Bands play there 3-4 days a week, outside, community events, keeping the spirit of the place going, this kind of arts and culture, do it yourself. Buffalo punches above its weight in arts and culture and theater and music, poetry, and so on. Also, a lot of really interesting landscape interventions that took this successional landscape and honed it a bit, played with it. There's a sculpture there. There's an old culvert. It was a pass through to the meadow that I showed you with the cottonwood tree of concrete slabs taken from a restoration of another building. They weren't needed. The old culvert taken also from some kind of public works project, and there's a boundary sculpture above it. This is on the railroad bed. Here's that cottonwood tree. A lot of little things done by different people, all done through partnership. He's not doing it all himself. People are coming to him and say, hey, I want to do this. You know, I want to have a festival. I want to project movies. I want to do something landscape. I say, okay, yeah. Do you know what you're doing? Can you have your assurance, right? A lot of interesting stuff happened that way. Here we go. So eventually, the moment comes in 2019 where Smith announces that he's entered a partnership with Generation Development to develop all the ancillary buildings from the grain elevators. And so the first phase here is with the American grain elevator. This is the warehouse. This is the old flour mill. And when it's done, that'll be 168 apartments, some community spaces, a hydroponic garden, some other things. And, you know, it was, for me, going to the site so often and having such intimate access, it was like a kind of, wow, it's you know, it was like a kind of melancholy moment. But Smith was kind of true to his words, and all these apartments will be affordable. At least the first phase, all 168, will come in at different levels of below area median income. All of the many of the arts and culture stuff that I'm showing you will continue. And if this goes right, we'll have phase 2 and phase 3 with 2 of the other elevators. And the 4th elevator, the marine elevator, will stay as is, as a kind of stabilized ruin. And Smith has this kind of big heart. He's very much into, it's not bullshit with him. He's really into Buffalo's refugee community. These guys are from Democratic Republic of Congo. They're now Buffalo residents. Smith built this, he's very into soccer. He built the youth soccer field for the refugee community. He employs lots of these guys. So the site is changing, but some things are potentially remaining the same and growing. Okay, well, we'll do Carrie a little quicker. This was the greatest steel plant in the United States. Here's where they made the iron, and here's where they made the steel. 500 acres. The iron was made here, put onto rail cars in its molten state, brought over into this complex where it was turned into American railroads, American highways, the Chrysler building, all of the Apollo and early space shuttle iron came from this site. So this is the site that made American infrastructure and made probably stuff around us here in Philadelphia, even though this is a US Steel, the Bethlehem Steel probably did most of the steel for Philadelphia stuff. This is what happened to the steel side. It turned into this. It turned into a giant parking lot with some stores, some entertainment. There's a couple of historic things that were preserved around the edges, the site of the 1892 Pinkerton Guards strike, this big important moment in US labor history. The pump house, that's preserved. The smokestacks were preserved, but most of it looks like this. I'm not against redevelopment in some cases, but I think we could all agree that this is kind of generic and banal and doesn't really speak to Southwest Pennsylvania. Meanwhile, that's a steel side. The iron side had a kind of a similar but slower plan for it, or the Park Corporation that owned both of these sites had wanted to clear it all as well. They cleared about 70% of the site, and then the market for scrap dipped, and they kind of couldn't finish the job. Meanwhile, there's a nascent industrial heritage movement going on in Southwest Pennsylvania, and advocates are out there trying to preserve what's left of this incredible storied plant. But on the site itself, it's becoming this kind of successional jungle and inviting, if you can get there, because it's really hard to get to if you don't have a car. You can't, Packard, easy to get to. Carry blast furnace is not so easy. Two of those insurgents were these people, Tim Callan and Liz Hammond, who were part of this industrial arts co-op. And for 50 odd Sundays, first they were there kind of exploring, messing around, and eventually said, hey, let's do something here. And they built this with found materials. They built the Carry Owl. They hung it from the top of this warehouse, this AC powerhouse. The Park Corporation found out. And that story is told in the book. I won't get into it because it's a complicated, kind of almost humorous, sad story. And this particular installation was taken down. They relocated their efforts for a while to Youngstown, Ohio, and did some things in the Briar Hill Mill, iron mill in Youngstown. Eventually, they found their way back to Cary, and they constructed the Cary Deer. And there you can see some of them on top of the Deer as it's about to be finished. The Cary Deer was built with all hand tools, all with found materials, metal found on site, bent in place, and constructed, and then hoisted up on top of this small building. From here to here is about 40 feet. So it's a really sizable structure. And it had to be, because otherwise it wouldn't have a kind of fair dialogue with the abandoned structures around it. Tim Callan said, those 50 Sundays were the best 50 Sundays of my life. Like working as a group, problem solving, getting things done. When the Deer was finished, it was almost transparent against all these machinery. What can we do to make it less transparent? They found these colored hoses, red, yellow, green, and blue, and they wove them. They washed them off, and then they wove them through the whole structure. So it gave it more definition, more contrast against the other buildings. So all of this was found. The Deer, Liz Hammond said to me, you know, the second we finished the Deer, I gave up ownership of it. That was it. It was about building it. We celebrated, we had a few beers, and then we moved on, right? They never, ever, this was finished in 1998, they never, ever expected it to last, let alone be incorporated as part of a National Heritage Area site. But the National Heritage Area Plan is gaining momentum in the first years of the 21st century. These guys here, Jim Kapusta is a former worker, has been invited back to give tours of the site. That they got former workers. They gave tours, very colorful tours about people losing limbs and that kind of thing. I've been on the tour 4 times. And Ron Baroff is the director of archives. He has various titles. And really, he's the kind of person who calls the shots at Cary. He knew about it, and he worked with the company that the Continental Real Estate that had owned it and Rivers of Steel Heritage Area to kind of keep that structure as part of the site. And it wasn't demolished. Eventually in 2006, it gets sold to Allegheny County, 138 acres with all of the buildings, and then given over to the, yeah. So a lot, much like Silo City, it's a do-it-yourself affair for the most part. Tours, DIY landscaping, low tech, the goats, events, the American Ninja Warrior, the Bach Choir, Festival of Combustion, you know, and we get to this moment, right? Because Allegheny County never really was comfortable with all of this. They wanted to demolish it so they could do a proper warehouses and that kind of a thing. But somehow Rivers of Steel was able to use all the arts and culture programming and combine with the industrial heritage to make something more of this site than if it was just an industrial heritage site. And now Allegheny County understands this as generating value, not subtracting value. And they have a whole plan for these other outparcels that are around the blast furnaces. So, okay, so these are the last 3 slides. You know, all these 5 sites are very different, and they have different ownership, different configurations, different states of repair, different contexts. But I look at all of these sites as being part of a continuum, right? Places don't stay the same. They never do, right? They grow, they become something else, they get redeveloped, they get restored, right? And what if we could understand that most people want this? They want the MCS, the Michigan Central Station, which is now being renovated by the Ford Motor Company to the tune of over $1 billion when you include their ancillary investments in the surrounding neighborhood, right? What if we could grow itinerant use, transgression into community action? What would that do if we played with those parts of this cycle? Could we get to incorporation, fundraising, and ownership transfer like the Central Terminal in Buffalo? Eventually, it might lead, we get historic registration, some kind of an investment, and eventually we get to this. But maybe in the process, this becomes something else. And this is the last or second to last slide. So, you know, I tried to make sense of these 5 case studies and get it to a point where I had something to say that would benefit architecture, city planning, landscape architecture. And these are some of the, and I had policy recommendations and recommendations for practitioners as well. And they're not hard and fast rules. They're not fully baked proposals, but they're rather, again, approaches. And maybe we can talk a little bit about this in the Q&A. But just to highlight just 2 or 3 of them, you know, everyone in this room, if you see a project, and you want it changed, it's really up to you to champion that. And if you're in the public sector or if you're in a university and somebody comes to you with one of these projects, it's really incumbent upon you to help that person figure it out. And maybe it is about finessing the rules. Maybe it's about buying time before something is destroyed. That's what happens in Buffalo. They go into the office of the buildings department and they try to buy time to keep buildings from standing. Another interesting lesson, you know, we're obsessed with the past and historic preservation, and all of our professions are obsessed with the future. the future will be better. We'll do this plan, right? But we rarely give enough credit to the present. The present is awesome. We can do things today. We can do things tomorrow. We can do things next month. What if we start doing these things now? How will the future change because we're engaging these now instead of just putting a fence around it? Let's think of these places as urban rather than objects. You can't treat these sites like a Frank Lloyd Wright house, even though that's what our historic preservation mechanisms in the United States do. Have to have faith that things will work out. All right, well, that's it. Well, thank you. I'm sorry I went over a little bit.
So while we pull up Fritz's slides, I'll just give you a really brief introduction. Many of you, of course, know Fritz. He's Dean and Paley Professor of the School of Design. Before coming to Penn, Fritz served as Dean of the School of Architecture and Henry M. Rockwell Chair in Architecture at the University of Texas at Austin for 15 years. Previously taught at Arizona State University, Washington State University, and the University of Colorado at Denver. And he just recently was awarded the 2024 Landscape Architecture Foundation Medal, one of the highest honors in the landscape architecture profession. So welcome, Fritz.
Thanks, Amy. And thank you, Dan. Thank you for writing this book, and it's a really fresh look at our fields. And everyone probably should read a lot of it, but especially for those of us in Philadelphia, the beginning starts with the discovery of Philadelphia. And those of you who aren't from Philadelphia, or like me from Ohio originally, the process of sort of discovering and eventually falling in love with Philadelphia is, it's usually not a love at first sight. I have a confession to make, and that is I was getting really bored with land acknowledgements. They're a quirky thing that emerged, through the pandemic. I found them getting really routine and shallow until Catherine came. And Catherine's kind of reinvented the land acknowledgement as a little bit of a mini history lesson. And from her inspiration, I want to talk a little bit about these people. We call them the Miami, and they call themselves the Miami. And this is a curious set of paintings. The one on the right was done by George Catlin in 1830. Is an actual portrayal of a man who we called Little Chief, and he went by Kimonso. And then there's the man on the left that was imagined by someone. And it's interesting, they're both holding something, one a battle axe and the other a flute. So our depictions, our understanding of Native Americans have been really skewed. And growing up, as I did in Ohio, the Miami, the downstream people, were everywhere but nowhere. And we Americans name places for what we destroy. We had the Great Miami River, the Little Miami River. We needed at least 3 Miami rivers. For a while, it was the Miami of the Lake, and now that's the Maumee River. Plus, we had the Miami and Erie Canal and Miami University. But we learned very little of the people that gave us these names. I would point out that people at Miami University, not to be confused with the University of Miami, proudly have T-shirts that declare that their university is older than the state of Florida. So in 1840, Andrew Jackson ordered Native people to be moved west of the Mississippi. We really should take that bastard's image off of a, what is it, $20 bill. He's a pretty awful man. The Miami were then herded by gunpoint and forced into canal boats down the Miami and Erie Canal, then down the Ohio River, the Mississippi and Missouri rivers to Kansas, only to be moved again to Oklahoma. So I bring this up because I want to talk about what Dan's book inspired me was to look at my hometown. And it's in the Rust Belt, Dayton, Ohio, and it was more of a manufacturing town than an industrial town. This is the National Cash Register Company. And the Olmsted Reach was really quite way beyond Buffalo and throughout the United States. The Olmsted brothers designed the campus. For the landscape architects in the audience, just imagine a big American corporation coming and saying, will you design our campus? So this is the NCR campus. This was the Old River Park for employees. And one thing you might notice is this was a day when only white people were allowed, and there was other days when Black people were allowed. And so it was segregated up until the 1960s. The Olmsted, as I mentioned, designed much of that area of Dayton, Ohio, including a fancy place for the managers of the NCR Corporation to live called Hills and Dales. This is a golf course that they designed. I was a caddy. I didn't know, when I was a caddy, I had no idea who the Olmsteds were. I had no idea what landscape architecture was. I realized I didn't like golf. I did like earning money from the guys I was carrying. But it was years later, I was sitting in a meeting and one of my, somebody from another university was giving a talk about the Olmsted brothers, and there's my golf course that I grew up on. So Dayton was an interesting place. The Frigidaire was located there. I'm named for somebody nobody in my family liked. His name was Fritz Steiner, and they didn't want to give, they thought I was going to die when I was born. They didn't want to give a good name away, so they called me Fritz. And it was named for my great-grandfather, who was a Wainwright. And I'll loop back around to what the importance of Wainwrights in a moment. But after we moved the Miami Indians down forcibly, down the Miami and Erie Canal, especially after 1848, Germans started to move up the Erie Canal, the Miami and Erie Canal. So it connected the Ohio River to Lake Erie. And many of them came with making skills and tool and die skills. It would become what's today the Interstate 75 corridor. And it's where, as Dan was mentioning about Detroit, it's where the automobile industry flourished, and General Motors branched out to things like Frigidaire. My uncle Bill was the head of design for Frigidaire. So he had kind of patent on things, like he's the guy who came up with the egg holder. Somebody had to, and he has the patent for the first ice machine. So Wainwrights, which means wagon makers were really important in the 1890s. So wagon makers, Wainwrights, needed to adapt, and they adapted along the I-75 corridor to making cars. So the skills that these German immigrants brought along the Miami-Erie Canal were very useful for the beginning of the automobile industry and related industries. This is Frigidaire. And then, of course, this could be one of Dan's slides, what's happened to these places. And his book just sort of hit me. There's so many places. I was with you in Shanghai 5 weeks ago. It could be a lot of parts of Shanghai. But there's also Delco Moraine. One reason why Dayton was very important for the automobile industry is a man named Charles Kettering invented the self-starter for the automobile. And Here it says, batteries are real simple. You just put them in your car and they work. And finally, Dayton also made airplanes. And this is the airplane making went away, but the Air Force Base remains. So of all those industries, the making of cash registers, the making of batteries, the making of refrigerators, the making of airplanes, they all went away, but we still have the fighter planes ready to go. So I'm looking forward, and I know I'm turning it over to a colleague who grew up north on I-75 in Michigan. So I'll turn it over to Kat. Or wait, we got a proper introduction. Sorry.
When we're recording, we have to do proper introductions. So years from now, we'll know who we are. Catherine Seavitt is professor and chair of the Department of Landscape Architecture here at the School of Design, where she holds the Martin and Margie Meyerson Chair of Urbanism. She's also the co-executive director of Penn's McHarg Center for Urbanism and Ecology and the creative director of LA Plus Journal. Catherine studies, among many other things, urban landscapes and post-industrial sites. So welcome, Catherine.
Hi, good evening. It's great to be here. This is just a very quick introduction to our conversation. So yes, we're going right up the I-75 to Detroit, which is my hometown. I think it ties really nicely to both Dan's book and Fritz's experience in Dayton. I don't have my land acknowledgement, but I would like to say there's a lovely essay called I Want to Drive in Geronimo's Cadillac. So maybe we can think about that as we go up to I-75. I just wanted to share 3 buildings that were really foundational to me. And I sort of lived a lot of things that Dan describes in his book. This is the Russell Industrial Center, where my first boyfriend had a workshop in Detroit. And this is actually from the Historic American Building Survey. And you can see it's being surveyed as a ruin already in the late 20th century, and incredible details here. I went back last March with students from a studio class. You can see them here in the cold of Detroit. And it has a new owner. It's still renting out spaces of production to artists. This is a glass artist. And there's a longstanding glass making factory there as well within the industrial center. So it's an interesting way kind of thinking about that DIY, but also spaces of production and creativity. Down the road from the Packard is a lovely little building, the Ford Motor Company's Ford Piquette plant on Piquette Avenue, where the first Model T rolled out, actually much prior to the later factories built by Albert Kahn. That's a sweat equity idea. So again, this really resonated with me when reading the book. And instead of, a bunch of old guys hanging around a model railroad set, they would actually rebuild buildings or go to the old train station. So this is a nice example of a bunch of folks retired, my father included, who really pitched in to kind of take back this building and to create a space where old model A, B, D, C, all the letters through T could be displayed within, in fact, the space that had been where they were drawn and constructed early on. Gosh, in the last 2 weeks, I've now brought both my parents to work. So my dad is in this picture, who is also a docent and gives tours at the Model T factory to my students, which was actually really a highlight of our trip there last March. And I was delighted to see my childhood neighbor, Richard Rubens, who also gives tours in the book on page 128 or so. And finally, the Michigan Central Station, which you saw beautifully evoked in Dan's book as well, how it functioned as a kind of incredible space up until the 1980s. And how it looked last March as well, again, in this kind of period of restructuring by Ford. And I can't just leave you without oh, we were so close last Sunday, and I love they lit it up for the Lions. So thank you so much. Yeah, we all were, right? And, they made it really far, which is great. So with that, that's all I have to say. I'd love to speak a little bit more about how these DIY post-industrial sites can flourish today. So thank you so much for the book talk. It was great.
Thank you.
Yeah.
So we'll just welcome you to take a seat here, and maybe to get us started, Dan, if you have some initial comments on the responses, and then we'll take a few questions, and we have a reception so we can keep the conversation going over wine and food.
Sure. Wow. I was looking at Fritz's, small world, right? When I was young, my father was an engineer, and he had to travel to a lot of let's call them B locations for lack of a better term. He did business with National Cash Register, and he came back and he was so excited that he got to play golf on that famous golf course there. And Catherine, it's incredible that you're connected to the Piquette plant, both the Piquette and the Russell Center. I think got buried in the footnotes. I had to edit that part out, but it's in the footnotes of the book. These are different, permutations or different things that have evolved, right? The Piquette plant is super special, but it's discrete. It's essentially one building, and it's manageable. And the building had tenants in it until the late 80s, right? So when the group that got together to purchase it, the building wasn't in such terrible condition. They were able to engage it and use it right away. They rented space out of it in the basement to other companies to help pay the bills. But it very much personifies this kind of post-industrial DIY, doing things incrementally as opportunities arise, not dwelling on mistakes when they happen, moving on. And even in the time that I've been visiting Piquette, and I try to go to Piquette, like, let's say every other time I go to Detroit, I go to Piquette because it really is special. I've watched their organizationally, they've grown, they've become more savvy fundraisers. They're having all kinds of events. I'm in there, they're setting up with menus in the main space. They're some kind of corporate retreat or anniversary. And that's part of it. That's definitely a part of what I'm getting at in this book. Like, we'll use the whole playbook. Whatever we can do to engage these buildings. Some of them will be very conventional, almost banal, and others will be novel or interesting or compelling in some other way. So I think that's a great example. But again, for these larger sites, it's hard to scale Piquette up. It really is, because you've got, in the case of Packard, multiple owners. You've got buildings in varying conditions. You have toxic materials that need to be remediated. It's not just, okay, we'll take the asbestos out of this one building. It's all over. It's in the ground. You also have Piquette is much closer to Woodward Avenue, so it doesn't feel so separate from a kind of central point in Detroit, whereas Packard is it's not that far from Piquette. Maybe it's another mile and a half to the east, but you kind of feel like you're out there in a part of Detroit that frankly hasn't seen any private sector investment and very little public sector, at least as far as landscape goes, as far as development goes, in many decades. So that kind of a condition, and some of these actions may be limited, may not be able to, and in fact, in Packard, these kinds of activities couldn't grow, or they hit their kind of ceiling and fell back. And that complicated history is told in my book from 1956 to 2022, right down to the point where some of those buildings came down in October of 2022. So great example. Russell Center, another great example. Packard could have been like a Russell Center incrementally 5,000 feet here, 10,000 feet there, rented out, and incrementally engaged in a way, much of the work being done by the actual occupants of the spaces for crafts, for art, for other aligned purposes. Did you want?
Yeah, see, there-
Yeah, we can jump to any questions and work in comments like that.
I'll ask a question. And this thought came up comparing and contrasting between the different presentations. I was wondering what your thoughts were on the whole layers of history that these sites have to deal with, that you're dealing with deep history, you're dealing with maybe only 200-year-old history. How do you balance those competing memories on sites like this, if there are, or if there's not, or if people even remember them? You know, there's this broader picture of memory and landscapes.
This is a great question, right? A lot of this kind of cultural transgressive history is often lost. Now we have the internet and we have people posting these pictures, so it's not quite what it was. There's some record of it. But this is a kind of negotiated thing. The history of these places is negotiated in each one of these sites. And this is the big blind spot in contemporary, the way we do historic preservation in the United States, where we're restoring buildings to a certain period of significance. And I wish Randy Mason was here, because he could talk to this, and he's written about it. And we know urban places are far more complicated. If you engage these buildings incrementally, you have an opportunity to draw upon all of these histories. And note that some of these histories are going to be in conflict. They're not, you can't necessarily tell every story. Trying to do so is crazy, right? So if you have a more incremental grassroots approach, you allow these stories to kind of come out and have more the sort of post-industrial story versus the industrial story, the rise versus the fall, the good versus the bad. You will give them a little greater quality.
Yeah, I love that question, actually. And even the history we think is old may not be as old as we think it is. Because when I was looking again, I hadn't thought of the Miami Indians in a while until you did a land acknowledgement the other night, and we were preparing for this. And even though their name was everywhere where I grew up, they really were more centered in Michigan and Indiana than Ohio, and really moved into Ohio relatively recently, about 1700. Primarily, I think, because of the destabilization between the English and the French. So the Native American history is also multi-layered and sometimes a lot more complicated. They were also colonists. They sort of took somebody else's land, and so I think trying to recognize those layers of history are really, really important.
I think one thing that maybe it's kind of going in another direction, but I think this idea of revealing things, there's also emergent things. And what I really love about so many of these sites is that spontaneous vegetation, that the capacity for the roof of the Packard to sprout trees born by wind-borne seeds landing on top of that, and actually kind of creating this other kind of ecology, which I think some folks, Matthew Gandy, for one, the geographer has spoken about the fourth nature. So what are these spontaneous urban novel ecosystems that really do enter into this, and how does that then become valued and protected and part of yet another history of both not only decay, but also this idea of emergence or growth? And I think it's quite interesting to think of these in this sort of urban ecological setting that we see so vividly in the silo city case as well. Like there's very much a kind of new ground that's being productive as well. So it's not just the human nostalgia and interest in decay, but also this other kind of emergent growth in life that is something that when these things do get restored to 100% purity on that kind of continuum that you described so beautifully between like neglect and 100% restoration, where is that kind of that space of urban growth as well in terms of like the landscape and the ecology?
Thank you for your talk. It's very interesting. You said there were too many stories to tell, and I wasn't clear about that. I think that those buildings represent stories that should be told, and we have means to capture them all. In fact, a couple of nights ago, I was at a talk given by Michelle Norris, who was a journalist, former NPR journalist. And her project is called The Race Card. And she's gone around the country inviting people to, in 6 words, capture their feelings about race. And I'm wondering, hey, why not for these buildings? I haven't taken a look at your book, so I'm assuming that you went around the country and did a comprehensive, like.
Not so comprehensive.
Okay. And one other.
I wish I could have done that, but I had a day job.
Okay. Which ties into my next question. Have you ever given thought to some sort of maybe national organization or office that would serve as a central body to coordinate maybe the collection of information, stories about these buildings, maybe even their development? Maybe it could be housed at AIA or ASLA, et cetera. Maybe even at Morgan State.
Yeah, Morgan, right. So these are all great points. First on the race, the point about race, a couple of the chapters deal with it more than others, but there is definitely a kind of difficult racial dynamic to unpack at all of these sites. I mean, the grain elevators may be aside, but the other 4 sites. And I try in the book to explore those issues that, in the case of the train station in Buffalo, it's a train station that's being kept alive by a bunch of like 3rd generation Polish immigrants, the kids of the third generation Polish Americans, in a neighborhood that they call Polonia, but has, it's about 60 or 70% African American and 20% Asian, right? So that neighborhood is changing, but they're holding on to this kind of almost a historic construct, right? And who's the train station for? If it wasn't for those Polish Americans, that train station wouldn't be there, right? So they have a kind of legitimate claim, but so do the people who live around there. And how do we make public investment? Now that particular building now has like $70 million in public investment that's been granted in the last few years. How do we now direct that money to make sure that all stakeholders have some kind of legitimate stake in it? And it's complicated figuring that out. And the Packard is even more complicated. It's one of the poorest neighborhoods in all the United States. Right? It's been in decline since the 1950s. The neighborhood is like over 90% Black. Nearly every block in that neighborhood is over 50% vacant lots. And it's been that way for decades. So, what responsibility do transgressors have to the people in that neighborhood, to the owner, Fernando Palazuelo, who bought that site and tried to do arts and culture, which hasn't really worked, what responsibility does he have to those people, right? And what about the government of Detroit? They've never been willing to invest in that building. They've always seen it as a brownfield that needs to be cleared. So this is really complicated, and I encourage you to read the book and give me feedback and let me know how you think. On your second question, we do have the National Historic Trust for Historic Preservation. That's the kind of larger body in the United States that's doing some of this work. Obviously, they can't do everything. But in Pittsburgh, the Rivers of Steel National Heritage Area is doing exactly as you're saying. So they have many sites, and they're collecting these histories and they're archiving them, and they continue to do it. And I think they're doing a pretty good job of it. Well, I'm glad it came up, right? Because I couldn't really bite that off. If I'd bitten it off, it would have been the whole presentation, you know? So that's why you write a book, so you can actually explore these things in greater depth. And I felt compelled to at least describe that. If you spend any time in Detroit and you're involved in urban development, you can't avoid it, and you can't pretend that it doesn't exist. And I try to do it justice as best as I could.
The other sort of national level group that sometimes enters into these kinds of areas is the National Park Service, of course. And I worked on the Blackstone Heritage Corridor in the 1980s, which has been pretty successful from Providence up to Worcester, Massachusetts. And the Park Service was moving very much towards a more urban-based focus. And I was part of a task force. And the last message I got from the National Park Service was the last day of December in 2016. So you can kind of remember what happened then. But there was a movement within the Park Service to look at more urban spaces, more post-industrial spaces. And there was precedence like the Blackstone Heritage Corridor to do so. And the Park Service also felt that there was a legal justification to enter into those areas. So I still think it's an opportunity for the Park Service, in addition to the National Trust, to move into the places that are everyday places, but important to our everyday history. Well,
it's happening. It's happening, and it probably could happen faster. There's a lot of ground to catch up to, but that kind of urban focus is difficult for the Park Service, and the Park Service mostly deals with these kind of sublime natural landscapes too. So the Blackstone Corridor is really the kind of top of these kinds of efforts.
So with that, I think we'll move to having some refreshments, and we can continue the.
oh, thank you.
Sure.
The last one. I'll make it brief.
Okay.
So I'm a local journalist, and I have a local nonprofit supporting local businesses. And my question is, how can I, through storytelling, encourage participation in sustainable living and encourage people to support their local businesses? I hope that question was relevant to tonight's discussion.
Good question.
Is that a loaded question?
That's a difficult, broad question, right?
Yeah, no, it's okay. Maybe one of my colleagues would like to take it here.
Well, I think it's something Dan said in his presentation. We start with ourselves and we start with our own actions. And if these are things you value, then I think, you take a stand on it and especially as a journalist, that's an opportunity to gain followers to that direction.
Well, thank you, Dan, Catherine, and Fritz, and to all of you, and we'll continue talking. Thank you.
I know it's fun.